For 2 years, Henry David Thoreau lived in solitude, surrounded by the untamed beauty of Walden Pond. While others relied on society for survival, he chose a different path, one of self-sufficiency, simplicity, and deep reflection. Raised in Concord, Massachusetts, Thoreau was no stranger to the comforts of civilization. Yet, in 1845, he set out to prove that a person could live deliberately, free from material excess, and in harmony with nature. Building a small cabin on the shores of Walden Pond, he relied on the land for food, warmth, and inspiration. Every skill, gathering firewood, growing crops, fishing, became a lesson in self-reliance. But his greatest challenges were not just the changing seasons and the demands of the wilderness. Thoreau's experiment in isolation tested his spirit, his resilience, and his philosophy. How did Henry David Thoreau endure 2 years alone in the woods? And what timeless wisdom did he uncover? The campfire is ready, so stay with me tonight. The story is about to begin. Chapter 1. When Henry David Thoreau first arrived at Walden Pond in the summer of 1845, the air was thick with the scent of pine, and the water shimmered under the golden light of the setting sun. He had visited this place many times before, drawn by its quiet beauty and the way the towering trees seemed to hold secrets of the past. But this time was different. This time he had come to stay. Walden Pond lay just a few miles outside of Concord, Massachusetts, yet it might as well have been another world. Here there were no bustling streets, no ringing church bells, no hurried conversations of merchants and townsfolk. Instead, there was only the rustling of the wind through the pines, the distant call of a loon across the water, and the rhythmic lapping of gentle waves against the shore. With an axe borrowed from a friend, Thoreau set to work building his new home. The physical labor was invigorating, each swing of the axe cutting not just into the wood, but into the expectations of a society that measured a man's success by wealth and property. He felled tall white pines, measuring and stacking each log with precision. His hands, unused to such strenuous work, blistered in the summer heat. But he pressed on, determined to shape his dwelling with his own labor. He salvaged discarded shingles and second-hand nails, spending only what was absolutely necessary. In total, the construction of his modest one-room cabin cost him just $28.12, a testament to his belief that a man could live comfortably with very little. It was not grand, nor was it meant to be. It was shelter, nothing more, nothing less. But Thoreau's journey to the woods was about more than building a cabin. It was a declaration, a rebellion against the creeping excesses of society. "I went to the woods," he would later write, "because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach." Each morning he rose with the sun, feeling the cool air against his skin as he stepped outside. His small bean field stretched before him, its delicate green shoots promising a future harvest. He had never been a farmer, but he found joy in the simple act of tending to the land, of watching things grow. His days were filled with work, chopping firewood, fishing in the pond, repairing his cabin. But there was also time for reflection. Long walks through the forest became a meditation. The whispering leaves, the sudden dart of a deer through the trees, the stillness of a hidden grove, all of it spoke to him in a language older than words. Yet even in solitude he was never truly alone. The woods teemed with life. Birds flitted through the branches, their songs weaving through the air. A family of foxes made their den nearby, their curious eyes watching him from a distance. The pond itself seemed alive, its surface shifting with the movements of fish, insects, and the occasional muskrat gliding silently through the water. Thoreau welcomed the company of nature, but he also received visitors from the human world. Farmers and fishermen passing through the area would stop by, intrigued by the man who had chosen to live alone. Children from Concord, hearing stories of the hermit in the woods, would wander down the winding paths to find him. Even the famous writer Ralph Waldo Emerson, Thoreau's friend and mentor, made visits, bringing books and lively discussions about philosophy and society. And then there were the unexpected guests, the outcasts, the wanderers, those searching for something beyond the confines of civilization. One evening, as the sun dipped below the treetops, a weary traveler arrived at Thoreau's cabin. He was a fugitive, a man seeking freedom from slavery, moving north on the Underground Railroad. Thoreau did not hesitate. He welcomed the stranger, offering food, water, and a place to rest, before he continued his perilous journey toward Canada. As the weeks passed, the rhythms of life at Walden Pond became second nature. The days blended into one another, each one a lesson in self-reliance. But while summer offered ease and abundance, Thoreau knew that the true test of his experiment had yet to come. The days were growing shorter, the air carried the first whispers of autumn, and soon the true challenge of living alone in the wilderness would begin. Winter was coming. Chapter 2. By the time September arrived, the landscape around Walden Pond had begun its slow transformation. The vibrant greens of summer faded into rich golds and deep reds. The air grew sharper, carrying with it the crisp scent of fallen leaves. Flocks of geese passed overhead, their distant cries echoing across the water as they journeyed south for the winter. For Thoreau, autumn was a time of reflection, a season that mirrored the passage of life itself. He spent hours wandering through the forest, observing how each tree prepared for the coming cold, how the squirrels busily gathered acorns, how the wind carried the last whispers of warmth before winter settled in. He had always believed that nature had lessons to teach those who listened, and as the days grew shorter, he listened carefully. But autumn was not just a time for contemplation. It was also a season of preparation. The easy abundance of summer was fading, and if he was to survive the winter alone, he would need to ensure that his small homestead was ready. Gathering for the long winter, Thoreau's diet at Walden was simple, consisting mainly of what he could grow, forage, or purchase with the small amount of money he earned from odd jobs. His bean field had provided a modest harvest, and he carefully stored the dried beans in sacks inside his cabin. But he needed more than beans to sustain himself through the long, cold months ahead. He spent days gathering nuts and berries, preserving what he could. He set fishing lines in the pond, catching perch and pickerel, which he salted and stored for later use. Occasionally he ventured to the town of Concord, where he bought a small amount of flour and cornmeal, enough to make simple bread. But food was not the only concern. He needed firewood, and plenty of it. Each morning before the frost had lifted, from the ground he took up his axe and ventured into the woods, cutting and splitting logs. He stacked them neatly beside his cabin, knowing that when the deep snows came, each log would be a shield against the bitter cold. The physical labor was exhausting yet deeply satisfying. With every stroke of the axe, with every pile of wood added to his store, he felt a growing connection to the land, to the cycle of the seasons, to the quiet rhythms of survival, the stillness of Walden Pond days. Autumn deepened. Walden Pond itself seemed to change. The once bustling waters grew calmer, as if the very surface of the pond was preparing for its winter slumber. Thoreau spent hours by the shore, watching the play of light on the water, listening to the silence. One evening, as he sat on a fallen log, he saw a single loon gliding across the surface. The bird let out its haunting, echoing call, a sound that seemed to carry the spirit of the wilderness itself. He watched as the loon dove beneath the water, disappearing for what seemed like an eternity before surfacing again, far from where it had entered. That moment stayed with him. The loon was a creature of mystery, of freedom, of resilience, and in its solitary existence, Thoreau saw a reflection of his own journey. Visitors at the cabin, though Thoreau had sought solitude, he was not entirely cut off from the world. Visitors still found their way to his cabin. Some came out of curiosity, townspeople, who had heard of the man living alone in the woods. Others came for conversation, fellow philosophers, writers, and thinkers who wanted to discuss ideas of nature, self-reliance, and the meaning of a simple life. One of his most frequent visitors was his friend and mentor, Ralph Waldo Emerson. The two men would sit outside the cabin discussing everything from poetry to politics to the deeper truths of existence. Emerson admired Thoreau's experiment, though he himself had no desire to live in such a way. Then there were the unexpected guests. One chilly evening, as Thoreau prepared his simple supper of cornbread and beans, he heard a rustling outside his cabin. When he opened the door, he found a weary traveler, a runaway slave, moving north toward freedom. Without hesitation, Thoreau welcomed the man inside, offering him food, water, and a place to rest. It was not the first time he had aided those seeking freedom, nor would it be the last. Though he had removed himself from society, he had not abandoned his beliefs. He was a firm opponent of slavery, and he saw it as his duty to help those in need, even from his small cabin in the woods. The first frost by, late October, the first frost covered the ground. The mornings were colder now, the breath of the forest turning into mist with the rising sun. Thoreau could feel winter's approach in the air, in the way the trees shed their final leaves, in the way the animals moved. With greater urgency, one night he woke to an eerie silence. Stepping outside, he found the pond surface glazed with a thin sheet of ice. The first freeze had come. He knelt by the shore, running his fingers over the delicate patterns formed by the cold. It was a small thing, an annual occurrence, but to him it was a moment of wonder. Winter was no longer a distant thought. It was here. And now the true test of his time in the wilderness was about to begin. With each passing day, Thoreau grew more attuned to the changing landscape around him. The forest was no longer just a collection of trees. It was a living entity, shifting and adapting with the seasons. He noticed how the maple leaves turned from bright red to a deeper shade of crimson before finally surrendering to the ground. The oak trees, more stubborn, held onto their leaves longer, rustling dryly in the wind. Every morning he took time to observe the world outside his cabin before beginning his daily tasks. He found comfort in the predictability of nature, in the way the sun cast golden light through the trees at dawn, in the way the pond mirrored the sky. It was a reminder that, despite all of civilization's complexities, life could be simple. The daily rhythm of life at Walden Thoreau structured his days with a balance of work, reflection, and exploration. After tending to his small bean field, in the early morning light, he would take his breakfast, often nothing more than a handful of nuts or a piece of cornbread left over from the previous night. He had no need for elaborate meals. Simplicity, he believed, was the key to true contentment. Once his immediate needs were met, he would often set out on long walks, wandering the woods with no particular destination in mind. He would follow the trails of deer through the underbrush, stopping to examine the intricate veins of a fallen leaf or the delicate architecture of a spider's web. He took joy in these small details, in the unnoticed miracles of the natural world. As he walked, he would often recite poetry to himself or compose lines of his own. He believed that solitude sharpened the mind, that being alone in the woods allowed him to hear his own thoughts more clearly. He carried a small notebook in which he recorded his observations, notes on the changing seasons, sketches of birds and plants, reflections on the nature of society. Encounters with wildlife. Thoreau had always been fascinated by animals, but now, living among them, he began to see them as neighbors rather than mere creatures. He took note of their habits, their interactions, their resilience. The red squirrels were among the most industrious of his woodland companions. He watched as they darted from branch to branch, chattering excitedly as they stored acorns for the Aya, winter. One particularly bold squirrel would often come close to his cabin, eyeing him curiously before scurrying away. The birds, too, were a constant presence. Blue jays flashed through the trees, their sharp cries echoing in the crisp air. Chickadees flitted close, fearless and inquisitive, sometimes landing just a few feet from where he stood. At night, he often heard the distant hoot of an owl, a lonely sound that somehow made the wilderness feel even larger. But it was the fox that intrigued him most. One evening, as he sat outside his cabin watching the sunset, he caught a glimpse of movement in the underbrush. A sleek, reddish-brown fox emerged, its eyes bright with intelligence. For several moments the two regarded each other, neither moving nor breaking the silence. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the fox slipped back into the shadows of the Wa. Forrest Thoreau was struck by the encounter. There was something wild and untamed in the fox's gaze, something that mirrored his own desire for freedom. He wondered how different they truly were, both creatures seeking solitude, both learning to survive in the wilderness on their own terms. Preparing for the deep cold by November, the air had grown bitter, and the days were noticeably shorter. The mornings were now filled with the crackling sound of frost underfoot, and the pond, which had only been lightly glazed with ice before, was now beginning to freeze more solidly at its edges. Thoreau doubled his efforts to prepare for the long months ahead. He spent hours chopping and stacking wood, ensuring he had enough fuel to keep his small cabin warm. He reinforced the walls with additional layers of insulation, stuffing moss and dry grass into the gaps to keep out the chill. Food, too, was a concern. While he had enough beans and cornmeal to last for a while, he continued to gather whatever he could from the forest, wild cranberries, chestnuts, and the last remaining edible roots before the ground froze solid. There was a certain satisfaction in this kind of labor, in knowing that he was entirely responsible for his own survival. He did not have the conveniences of town life, but he had something far more valuable, a sense of self-reliance, of harmony with the land. And yet, despite all his preparations, he knew that winter in the woods would bring challenges unlike any he had faced before. The silence of the woods. There was a moment in late autumn when Thoreau realized he had grown entirely accustomed to the silence of the woods. It was not an absence of sound, but rather a fullness of it, a quiet so deep and encompassing that it became its own kind of music. The wind through the pines had its own rhythm, whispering secrets of the forest's ancient past. The rustling of dry leaves beneath his feet was a soft counterpoint, a reminder of time's steady march forward. And at night, when the world seemed to hold its breath, he could hear the distant rhythmic call of an owl, a solitary voice in the darkness. Thoreau had always believed in the importance of solitude, but now he was beginning to understand its true nature. It was not loneliness, as some might think, but rather a state of being entirely present with oneself. In the silence of the woods he found a clarity that had eluded him in the bustling world of Concord, and yet, despite his love for solitude, there were moments when he longed for conversation, not idle chatter, but the kind of deep, meaningful exchange that sharpened the mind. Fortunately, the woods were not entirely devoid of company. Unexpected visitors. One crisp afternoon, as he sat outside his cabin mending a tear in his coat, he heard the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps. He looked up to see a man emerging. From the trees, his figure silhouetted against the golden light of the setting sun. It was a local farmer, a man named John Field, who had heard of Thoreau's peculiar experiment in the woods and had come to see it for himself. Field was a hard-working man, burdened with the endless toil of plowing, planting, and harvesting. He could not understand why anyone would choose to live in such a manner, to remove themselves from society, to live with so little. Thoreau welcomed him warmly, offering him a seat by the fire. They spoke at length, Thoreau sharing his thoughts on simplicity and self-reliance, while Field shook his head, skeptical but intrigued. "Don't you ever feel the need for more?" Field asked, gesturing to the modest interior of the cabin. "More comfort? More security?" Thoreau smiled. "I have all that I need." The world convinces us that we must always be striving for more, but what if contentment lies in having less? Field left before nightfall, still unconvinced but visibly thoughtful. Thoreau watched him disappear into the trees, wondering if their conversation had planted a seed in the man's mind, if one day he too might seek the quiet freedom of the woods. The first snowfall. As November deepened, the first snowfall came gently, almost hesitantly. At dawn, Thoreau stepped outside to find the world transformed. His cabin roof blanketed in white, the trees wearing coats of snow, the pond surface beginning to harden with ice. There was a beauty in the stillness of winter, in the way the land seemed to pause, taking a deep breath before the long months ahead. The tracks of deer and foxes were suddenly more visible against the pristine snow, each imprint telling a story of movement and survival. Thoreau took this as a signal to adjust his daily routines. Chopping wood became a priority, the rhythmic thud of his axe against the logs filling the silent air. He stacked the wood carefully, knowing it would be his greatest ally against the biting cold. Inside, he made use of the last of the autumn harvest, cooking simple meals over the fire. He found satisfaction in the act of preparing his food, in knowing that each meal was the result of his own labor. He was not dependent on markets or merchants, only on his own two hands and the generosity of the land. A night by the fire one particularly cold evening. As the wind howled outside and snow piled against the door, Thoreau sat by the fire with his journal in hand. The flickering flames cast long shadows across the wooden walls, the warmth of the fire wrapping around him like a familiar embrace. He reflected on the weeks that had passed, on the lessons the woods had already taught him. He had come here seeking simplicity, but what he had found was something deeper, a profound connection to the land, to the rhythms of nature, to the quiet truths that revealed themselves in moments of solitude. He picked up his pencil and began to write, the words flowing easily onto the page. "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the room. Thoreau closed his journal, letting the silence settle around him once more. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in quiet white, frozen reflections. The days grew shorter, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long blue shadows across the snow-covered ground. Thoreau found himself adjusting to the rhythm of winter, rising with the pale light of morning and retreating to his cabin as darkness fell early in the evening. Walden Pond, which had once mirrored the summer sky in its still, glassy surface, was now locked beneath a thick sheet of ice. He took pleasure in observing the slow transformation, the way the ice formed first in delicate, lace-like patterns along the edges, before creeping inward, solidifying into a crystalline expanse. Some mornings he would walk out onto the frozen pond, listening to the deep, resonant groans of the ice shifting beneath his feet. It was as if the earth itself were speaking in a language that only those who truly listened could hear. As he knelt by the edge of the ice, peering into its depths, he thought of how this frozen world was merely a moment in time, a pause before the inevitable thaw of spring. He had come here to observe nature, but he was beginning to realize that he was also observing himself, his thoughts, his habits, his place in the grand cycle of life and decay. Encounters with the wild Thoreau was never truly alone in the woods. The creatures of Walden, foxes, squirrels, owls, and deer, were his quiet companions, their presence a reminder that he was a guest in their world. One evening, as he sat outside his cabin watching the snow drift down in soft, swirling patterns, a red fox emerged from the trees. It moved with effortless grace, its bushy tail brushing against the untouched snow. The fox paused, its sharp eyes locking onto Thoreau's. For a moment neither moved, two beings in silent recognition of each other. Then, just as swiftly, the fox turned and vanished into the woods, its footprints the only evidence that it had ever been there. On another occasion, he watched a family of otters playing along the frozen pond, sliding across the ice with joyful abandon. Their carefree energy was infectious, and Thoreau found himself laughing out loud at their antics. These encounters, brief yet profound, reinforced his belief that the natural world was not separate from man, but rather an extension of himself. There was wisdom in the way the animals lived, without excess, without waste, existing in perfect harmony with their surroundings. The fire. Within, despite the harshness of winter, Thoreau felt an inner warmth that no fire could provide. It was the warmth of self-reliance, of knowing that he could provide for himself, survive without the comforts of civilization. Each morning he would gather firewood, splitting the logs with rhythmic precision, stacking them carefully against his cabin wall. The act of tending to the fire, feeding it just enough to keep it burning through the night, became a ritual, one that mirrored his own internal flame, the quiet determination that had brought him here in the first place. At times, as he sat before the fire, he would think of the people in Concord, huddled indoors, their lamps glowing softly through frosted windows. He wondered if they ever thought of him, if they imagined him struggling in the cold. But he was not struggling. He was thriving. Solitude and society, though Thoreau cherished his solitude, he was not entirely cut off from the world. He still made occasional visits to town, walking the familiar roads with a newfound perspective. When he entered the shops or passed by the homes of acquaintances, he observed the hurried pace of life, the endless cycle of labor and consumption. He listened as men spoke of profits and debts, of news from distant places, of concerns that seemed to him so far removed from the essence of living. He would engage in conversation, sharing glimpses of his life at Walden, but he often found that his words were met with puzzled expressions or polite nods. Many could not understand why he had chosen such a path. "Are you not lonely out there?" one man asked him. Thoreau smiled. "I have never felt less alone." He would return to his cabin with a deepened appreciation for the simplicity of his days, for the quiet moments that others seemed to fear. The night of the storm one night, a great storm rolled in from the west, the wind howling through the trees like a restless spirit. Thoreau lay in his cabin, listening as the branches outside groaned under the force of the gale. Then came the first crash, a mighty limb torn from its place, hitting the ground with a force that shook the earth. Thoreau sat up, feeling the power of nature in its rawest form. The wind battered against his cabin walls, but he felt no fear. Instead, he felt a deep reverence, an awe for the untamed force that surrounded him. This was the world as it had always been, long before man had sought to tame it. He wrapped himself in his blanket and let the storm rage on, knowing that come morning the woods would be transformed once more. A day in the life at Walden Pond winter had settled fully now, and Thoreau's days followed a steady rhythm. Mornings began with the crackle of firewood as he stoked the embers from the night before. He would step outside into the crisp air, his breath forming small clouds as he walked to the pond's frozen shore. Some days he would carve a hole through the thick ice to fetch water, watching as the surface quickly began to frost over again in the bitter cold. Other mornings he simply stood in stillness, watching the way the first rays of the sun painted the snow in hues of gold and blue. After gathering wood and tending to small repairs around his cabin, he would set out on foot, his heavy boots crunching over the snow as he walked through the woods. He was not wandering aimlessly. Each journey was an exploration, a lesson in observing the land with new eyes. He studied the way the wind sculpted the snow into waves, how the bare trees whispered against one another in the breeze, how the footprints of a rabbit told a silent story of survival. Afternoons were often spent writing in his journal by the fire, capturing the moments of the day in careful prose. Some evenings he read by the flickering light of his lamp, immersing himself in the works of the great thinkers who had come before him. The routine was simple, yet deeply fulfilling. Every task had meaning, every moment felt intentional. Memories in the snow. There were times when solitude gave way to reflection, when the quiet of the forest stirred old memories. One evening, as Thoreau sat by the fire, watching the shadows dance along the wooden walls of his cabin, he found himself thinking of his brother John. He had died years earlier from a sudden illness, leaving a void in Thoreau's heart that time had never truly filled. John had been his closest companion, his kindred spirit. They had shared adventures, laughter, and long walks through these very woods. Now, those memories came to him like ghosts, soft, fleeting, yet ever present. Thoreau closed his eyes and listened to the wind outside. He wondered what John would think of his life here, of the path he had chosen. Would he understand? Would he approve? A smile touched his lips. John had always believed in him. And in that moment Thoreau felt his presence, not as a ghost, but as an unspoken encouragement, a quiet reminder that he was exactly where he needed to be. The hunger of the wild one of the greatest challenges of winter was securing enough food. The abundance of summer and autumn had faded, leaving the land quiet and still. Though Thoreau had prepared well, stocking up on rice, cornmeal, and other provisions, he still relied on the land whenever possible. He set traps for small game, but only took what was necessary, never more. Fishing through the ice became a valuable skill. Some mornings he would sit for hours, his breath forming clouds in the air as he waited patiently for a tug on the line. The thrill of catching a fish never faded. It was a moment of connection between himself and the unseen world beneath the ice. He also foraged what he could. Dried berries hidden beneath the snow, pine needles steeped in hot water for a simple yet nourishing tea. He learned to appreciate the taste of the land, to understand the gifts it offered in each season, and in doing so he felt more alive than he ever had before. Chapter 3. The deepening silence. As winter stretched on, the solitude of Walden Pond grew even deeper. The snow muffled all sound, creating a world of profound stillness. Some days it felt as though he was the last man on earth, the only witness to the quiet beauty that surrounded him. But this silence was not empty. It was full of thought, of presence, of an awareness that could only be felt in moments. Of true solitude, Thoreau had always believed that most men lived lives of quiet desperation, trapped in a cycle of labor, obligation, and distraction. Here, in the heart of the woods, he was free from all of that. He was no longer merely existing, he was truly living. Reflections on society. Though he had chosen this life, Thoreau often found himself reflecting on the world he had left behind. He thought of Concord, of the men and women who hurried through their days, consumed by tasks that seemed, to him, devoid of true meaning. He thought of the endless pursuit of wealth, of status, of things that could never truly satisfy the soul. One evening, as he sat by the fire, he picked up his journal and wrote, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." These words had been forming in his mind for weeks, perhaps even months. Now, as he wrote them down, he felt their truth in his very bones. The unspoken conversations of the forest as winter deepened, Thoreau's senses became more attuned to the rhythms of the wilderness. The stillness of the forest was deceptive. Beneath the blanket of snow, life continued, quietly persisting. He learned to read the landscape like a book. The delicate imprints of a hare told him where it had foraged the night before. The deep, steady tracks of a deer spoke of a lone wanderer seeking shelter. Even the absence of movement conveyed meaning, the woods holding their breath before a storm. One morning, he followed the fresh trail of a fox weaving through the underbrush, with quiet steps. The fox was an old companion, one he had glimpsed on more than one occasion, its fiery coat standing out against the snow. It moved with a careful grace, its instincts honed by years of survival. Thoreau admired the fox not just for its cleverness, but for its way of being. It lived without excess, without waste, taking only what it needed. There was a lesson in that, he thought. And so, in the quiet of Walden, Thoreau found himself listening, not just with his ears, but with his whole being. The solitude that shapes a man winter was relentless. The days were short, the nights stretched endlessly. There were times when loneliness whispered at the edges of his mind, testing his resolve. He had never feared solitude, but in the heart of winter he came to understand its true weight. It was not simply the absence of others, it was a confrontation with the self. Many men would have sought distraction, would have longed for the comfort of voices, of laughter, of the familiar warmth of society. But Thoreau welcomed the silence. It stripped away all pretense, leaving only what was real. In those long nights, as the wind howled outside his cabin, he asked himself the questions that most avoided. What does it mean to truly live? What, if anything, endures beyond this fleeting existence? He had no easy answers, but he knew this. He was not afraid of the questions. The visit of a friend. Despite his retreat into solitude, Thoreau was not entirely alone. There were occasional visitors, fishermen from nearby, travelers passing through, and, most cherished of all, his friend Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson had been his mentor, his confidant, and in many ways the reason he had come to Walden in the first place. It was Emerson who had allowed him the use of this land, who had encouraged his experiment in self-reliance. One afternoon, as the snow fell in thick, silent flakes, Thoreau heard the crunch of approaching footsteps. He opened his door to find Emerson standing there, bundled in a heavy coat, his face alight with quiet amusement. "You look well," Emerson said, stepping inside and shaking the snow from his shoulders. Thoreau smiled. "I am well." The two men sat by the fire, the warmth thawing the chill from Emerson's hands. They spoke of many things, the changing seasons, the affairs of Concord, the books they had read. But beneath it all, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Emerson admired Thoreau's resolve, even if he did not always understand it. And Thoreau, in turn, appreciated Emerson's wisdom, even as he sought his own path. As the afternoon waned, Emerson rose to leave. He placed a hand on Thoreau's shoulder, his expression thoughtful. "You have found something here," he said. "Something most men spend their lives searching for." Thoreau nodded. He did not need to say anything. Emerson already knew. The long nights of reflection as winter stretched on, Thoreau's thoughts deepened. The stillness of the forest, the endless whiteness, the isolation. These were not hardships to endure, but teachers revealing truths that could only be learned in solitude. By candlelight, he wrote furiously in his journal, capturing fleeting thoughts before they vanished into the cold air. He pondered the nature of time, how it passed differently here, unshaped by the clocks and schedules of the town. Days were not measured in appointments, but in the slow, deliberate rising and setting of the sun. He recalled a passage from his readings. Time is but the stream I go a-fishing in. I drink at it, but while I drink, I see the sandy bottom and detect how shallow it is here at Walden. He felt the truth of those words. The days were not slipping away unnoticed, lost in routine. They were full, rich, each one distinct from the last. At times he felt himself dissolving into the very landscape, no longer a man separate from nature, but a part of it, no different from the trees, the river, or the creatures that moved unseen. Through the woods, and in those silent nights, wrapped in furs by his fire, he wondered, was this the truest way to live? A test of endurance, but nature was not always kind. One evening, as Thoreau ventured out to check his food stores, a bitter wind cut through his coat like a knife. The cold was sharper than usual, a warning of an approaching storm. Overhead, the sky had darkened, thick with low-hanging clouds. He hurried inside, reinforcing the gaps in his cabin walls with strips of cloth. He had learned from past winters that preparation was everything. By midnight, the storm had arrived. The wind howled like a living thing, shaking the very foundation of his small home. Snow piled against the door, sealing him inside. The fire burned low, its warmth barely enough to push back the creeping cold. For 2 days he was trapped, surviving on dried beans and the last of his bread. He read by the dim glow of his lantern, listening to the wind's relentless assault. The solitude was not peaceful now. It was absolute, consuming. He imagined how easy it would be to lose oneself in such a place. How many men had perished in the wilderness, not from starvation or wild beasts, but from the weight of their own thoughts. But Thoreau did not fear the storm. He welcomed it. It was another lesson, another test. And when, on the third morning, the wind finally died down and the sun broke through the clouds, he stepped outside to a world reshaped by snow, glistening and untouched. The storm had passed, and he was still here. Visitors from the wild. As the weeks of winter dragged on, Thoreau became more aware of the animals that shared the forest with him. One morning, he awoke to find fresh tracks near his cabin, large, deliberate paw prints leading toward the pond. A great lynx had passed through in the night, silent and unseen. Another evening, as he sat reading, he heard a rustling outside. Peering through a crack in the door, he spotted a family of deer moving cautiously through the trees, their breath visible in the cold air. He watched them for several minutes, their delicate movements a stark contrast to the harsh landscape. But the most persistent visitor was a small red squirrel. It had grown bold over the months, venturing close whenever Thoreau was outside splitting wood. It would watch him from a low branch, tail twitching, eyes bright with curiosity. One afternoon, feeling indulgent, Thoreau scattered a handful of cornmeal outside his door. The squirrel hesitated, then darted forward, stuffing its tiny cheeks, before vanishing up the nearest tree. It was a small thing, an insignificant moment, and yet Thoreau found himself smiling. Though he had chosen a life of seclusion, Thoreau was not entirely cut off from civilization. Every few weeks he made the trek to Concord to replenish supplies, sell firewood, and occasionally engage in conversation with old friends. On one such journey, the road was treacherous with ice, forcing him to move cautiously. The town, when he arrived, felt almost foreign, noisy, crowded, bustling with life. He stopped by a small shop where he purchased flour and a bit of salt. The shopkeeper, an older man with keen eyes, studied him for a moment. "You've been out at the pond all winter, haven't you?" he asked. Thoreau nodded. The man shook his head, half in admiration, half in amusement. "Can't imagine why you'd choose to live like that." Thoreau simply smiled. How could he explain it? How could he put into words the beauty of a frozen lake at sunrise, the quiet wisdom of a snow-covered forest, the sense of freedom that came from answering only to the rhythm of nature? Some things could not be explained. They had to be lived. After making his purchases, he lingered for a short while in town, exchanging brief pleasantries with acquaintances. But even as he spoke, his mind was already back in the woods. By nightfall, he had returned to Walden. The moment he stepped into his cabin, he felt a deep sense of relief. The air was colder here, the silence heavier. But this was home. He added a fresh log to the fire, listening to it crackle and pop. Outside, the stars burned brightly in the winter sky. He was exactly where he was meant to be. Chapter 4. The Thawing World. The first signs of spring-winter had gripped Walden Pond for months, but as February waned, Thoreau began to sense a shift in the air. The cold still lingered, but some mornings the wind carried a gentler touch, whispering promises of the coming thaw. One afternoon, as he wandered near the edge of the frozen pond, he noticed something remarkable, a thin ribbon of water, dark and glistening where the ice had begun to crack. He crouched beside it, dipping his fingers into the icy flow. The water was frigid, but alive, restless, no longer trapped in winter's hold. He smiled to himself. Spring was coming, the melting silence as. The days stretched longer. Thoreau could feel the world around him beginning to stir. The great silence of winter, the hush of snow-covered forests, the muffled stillness of frozen waters, was slowly breaking apart. Each morning the sun rose a little earlier, melting away the frost that clung to the trees. The once frozen pond groaned under the weight of change, its icy shell splitting with sharp cracks that echoed through the woods. One evening, as he stood at the water's edge, he heard the sound of dripping, slow at first, then persistent, as if the entire forest were weeping in relief. The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible. Patches of brown earth emerged where snow had once lain undisturbed. Tiny rivulets of water ran down the hillside, forming miniature streams that carried away the last remnants of winter. One day he spotted a squirrel darting across the forest floor, no longer searching for buried food stores, but nibbling fresh buds. Spring had not yet arrived in full, but it was coming. Reflections by the fire, as nature awakened around him, Thoreau found himself deep in thought. All winter he had lived in perfect solitude, speaking only to himself, the birds, and the wind. But with the thaw came a shift, not just in the landscape, but within him. He had long believed that true wisdom could be found in isolation, away from the distractions of society. Yet as he sat by his fire one evening, he wondered, was solitude meant to last forever? He thought of the people in town, the shopkeepers, the farmers, the old men who gathered by the tavern, exchanging stories. He had left their world behind, choosing to build his own. But was it possible to be too alone? He stirred the embers, watching the flames flicker and twist. He did not yet know the answer. The return of the birds one morning, Thoreau awoke to a sound he had not heard in months, a birdsong, light and clear, carrying through the cool morning air. He stepped outside, scanning the trees. There, perched on a bare branch, was a small blackbird, its feathers ruffled against the lingering chill. He smiled. The birds were returning. Soon more would follow. Robins, sparrows, the great geese that filled the skies in long, wavering formations. Each year they came as if summoned, drawn back by something unseen, yet undeniable. The forest was stirring. Life was beginning anew. And so was he, the language of ice each morning. Thoreau took his usual walk to the pond, listening closely. The ice had its own language, groans, creaks, sudden pops that split the stillness like the report of a rifle. The surface was no longer solid and reliable, but restless, uncertain, as if the pond itself were waking from a long slumber. 1. Afternoon, he crouched near the shore and tapped the ice with a stick. A faint tremor rippled outward, vanishing beneath the surface. Then, as if in answer, the ice moaned, a deep, resonant sound, that seemed to rise from the very depths of the water. It was eerie, beautiful. He realized that this transformation was not destruction, but renewal. The ice was not breaking apart to disappear, but to give way to something softer, warmer, full of movement, just like life itself. A visit from an old acquaintance one chilly morning, as he was stacking firewood outside his cabin. Thoreau heard footsteps crunching through the thinning snow. He turned to see a familiar figure approaching, Sam Staples, the town constable. "Thought I'd find you out here," Sam said, grinning, as he pulled his coat tighter around himself. "Not many folks in Concord take to living out in the woods," Thoreau chuckled. "Not many folks in Concord know what they're missing." Sam leaned against a nearby tree, watching the cabin with mild amusement. "I'd say you've done well for yourself. Place looks sturdy. You keeping warm enough?" Thoreau nodded. "Plenty of firewood, plenty of blankets, and plenty of thoughts to keep me busy." The two men talked for a while, of the town, of the changing season, of the way life seemed to drift forward, whether one noticed or not. Sam mentioned a few names from Concord, people Thoreau hadn't thought about in months. It was strange, hearing of their lives continuing as if he had never left. Before he departed, Sam pulled something from his coat pocket, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Brought you some biscuits," he said gruffly. "Figured you wouldn't mind a little taste of home." Thoreau accepted the gift with a grateful nod. It was a small gesture, but it reminded him that even in solitude he was not entirely forgotten. As he watched Sam disappear down the wooded path, he found himself wondering, did he miss them? The people, the chatter, the familiar routines? He wasn't sure. The first rain one evening, as he sat at his writing desk, a soft pattering sound began to fill the cabin. At first, he mistook it for wind rustling the branches. But then he smelled it, that distinct, earthy scent, damp and fresh. Rain. Stepped outside and tilted his face toward the sky. A light drizzle was falling, barely more than a mist, but it was enough to darken the soil, to send tiny droplets trickling down the bark of trees. After months of dry, frozen air, the rain felt like a blessing. He walked slowly through the woods, listening to the raindrops tapping against the leaves that had only just begun to unfurl. Small pools formed in the dips of the forest floor, catching the silver light of the moon. Everything was changing. Breaking the ice a week later, it happened. With a great echoing crack, a massive sheet of ice broke free from the pond's surface and drifted lazily toward the shore. Thoreau stood at the water's edge, watching as more pieces splintered and fell away, revealing the deep, shifting blue beneath. The pond was waking up. Soon, the ice would vanish entirely. Fish would return to its depths, birds would skim its surface, and life, so long suspended, would begin again. He took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp, damp air. Winter had passed, spring had arrived, and with it something new, something yet to be discovered. Chapter 5. The Greener Days. The Forest Awakens. The transformation was slow but unmistakable. Where bare branches had once reached like skeletal fingers toward the sky, tiny buds were now emerging, delicate, hesitant, but determined. The forest floor, once buried in frost, had begun to soften, giving way to shoots of green that pushed through the damp soil. Each day Thoreau took note of these changes. He watched as the first wildflowers timidly unfurled their petals, as the squirrels became bolder, scurrying through the underbrush in search of fresh food. He listened to the rustling of leaves in the breeze, a sound he hadn't heard in months. The world was stirring, and so was he. A new rhythm spring had arrived, not in an instant, but in a series of quiet, unremarkable moments. A warmer breeze here, a melting patch of snow there. The forest, once locked in winter's stillness, had begun to move again, slowly at first, then with increasing vigor. For Thoreau, life at Walden took on a different rhythm. Winter had been about survival. keeping warm, tending the fire, rationing supplies. But now, as the earth softened and the air warmed, his focus shifted. Each morning he stepped outside to a world that seemed slightly different than the day before. The trees held the faintest hint of green. The birds were no longer just visitors, but residents, filling the air with their calls. The ground, once frozen solid, yielded under his feet, damp with the promise of growth. He felt it in himself, too, a stirring, a quiet excitement. Spring was a time of renewal, not just for the land, but for the soul, the arrival of the geese. One crisp morning, as he was gathering wood near the pond, Thoreau heard it, a distant honking cry. Then another, and another. He looked up. There, against the pale blue sky, a great V-shaped formation of geese soared overhead, their wings beating in perfect harmony. They moved with purpose, driven by an instinct older than memory, their path, unbroken, unwavering. Thoreau watched until they disappeared beyond the tree line, their voices fading into the distance. He had seen them leave in the autumn, their departure marking the beginning of the long, silent winter. Now they had returned. It was as if they carried spring on their wings. Rebuilding the garden, as the land thawed, Thoreau turned his attention to his small garden. The soil was damp, rich, eager for life. He ran his hands through it, feeling the cool earth crumble between his fingers. Last year he had grown beans, potatoes, and squash. Simple things, but they had nourished him. Now it was time to plant again. He worked methodically, marking neat rows, pressing seeds into the earth with careful hands. It was slow, deliberate work that required patience but promised reward. As he tilled the soil, he thought about the farmers in Concord. They plowed their fields with teams of oxen, sowing vast acres of wheat and corn. Their work was for profit, for the market, for the endless cycle of trade. His work was different. He was not farming to sell, not planting to feed others. He was simply tending to the land, living in harmony with it, asking nothing more than what it freely gave. There was a kind of peace in that. Visitors from the village one afternoon, as he knelt by the water's edge, washing the dirt from his hands, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the forest path. He turned to see two figures approaching. It was John Field, an Irish laborer from Concord, and his young son, both dressed in worn but sturdy clothes. Thoreau wiped his hands on his trousers and stood to greet them. "Afternoon, Henry," John said, shifting his weight awkwardly. "Thought we'd pay a visit? My boy here, he's never seen a man living out in the woods like this." Thoreau smiled, gesturing toward his cabin. "Then let me show you." As they stepped inside, the boy's eyes widened, taking in the simple wooden walls, the rough-hewn furniture, the stacks of books lining the shelves. "You live here? All by yourself?" the boy asked, his voice filled with wonder. Thoreau nodded. "For nearly a year now." John shook his head. "I don't know how you do it. No comforts, no company, no steady work. Seems a hard way to live." Thoreau studied. The man's face, weathered, lined with worry. He knew John worked long hours on other men's farms, breaking his back for wages that barely fed his family. "To me," Thoreau said gently, "the harder way is working for things one does not need." John sighed. "Maybe, but it puts food on the table." Thoreau said nothing. There was truth in both their ways of living. Nights. Under the stars, as spring deepened, the nights grew softer. The bitter cold of winter had given way to something gentler. Coolness that refreshed rather than punished. Some evenings, instead of retreating to his cabin, Thoreau lay outside, stretched out on the earth, watching the stars emerge one by one. The sky here was different than in Concord. In town, the lights from houses and street lamps dimmed the heavens, turning them into a pale wash. But here, in the solitude of Walden, the stars burned bright and sharp, infinite in their expanse. He traced the constellations with his eyes, the Hunter, the Bear, the great river of the Milky Way. He thought of ancient men looking up at the same sky, telling stories of gods and beasts. How small his life seemed beneath such vastness, yet at the same time how perfect, a world in bloomy. Late April, Walden Pond was no longer the silent retreat it had been in winter. Life was everywhere. The trees, once bare and skeletal, now stretched their branches skyward, cloaked in fresh, tender green. The undergrowth, which had lain dormant for months, was alive with movement. The rustling of squirrels, the darting of birds, the soft whisper of leaves shifting in the breeze. Thoreau walked the familiar paths around the pond and marveled at how the land transformed itself, not through any sudden miracle, but through 1,000 tiny changes, buds swelling, rivers swelling, the sun lingering just a moment longer each evening. He bent down to examine a patch of violets pushing up through the damp soil, their purple petals trembling in the breeze. He had seen this sight every spring of his life, yet here, in the quiet solitude of Walden, it felt like witnessing creation. For the first time, spring was not just a change of seasons, it was a reminder that no matter how long the winter, life always returned, the return of the fisherman. One morning, as mist curled over the pond's surface, Thoreau spotted a figure standing at the water's edge. It was a fisherman from Concord. The man, an old acquaintance, cast his line in slow, practiced movements, his silhouette reflected in the still water. He did not speak at first, nor did Thoreau interrupt. They existed in parallel, both absorbed in the morning hush. At last, the fisherman pulled his line in, inspected the empties, hook, and gave a wry chuckle. "Seems the fish aren't awake yet," he said. Thoreau smiled. "Perhaps they prefer to rise with the sun, not before it." The man wiped his hands on his trousers and glanced toward the small cabin nestled among the trees. "You still content out here? Henry, no itch to come back to town?" Thoreau shook his head. "Each day out here I feel I am living with greater intention. The town is full of noise, but here—" He gestured to the pond, the trees, the rising sun. "Here I listen, and the world speaks." The fisherman nodded, though he did not quite understand. "Well," he said, casting his line again, "maybe the fish will have something to say soon enough." A thunderstorm in the woods late one afternoon, dark clouds rolled in from the west. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, sending ripples across the surface of the pond. Thoreau watched from his cabin as the first raindrops struck the earth. Then, in an instant, the heavens opened. Rain fell in thick sheets, drumming against the roof, soaking the ground, washing the dust from the leaves. Thunder rumbled through the valley, deep and resonant, shaking the very air. Thoreau stepped outside. The rain soaked through his clothes in seconds, but he did not mind. He tilted his head back, letting the cool water run down his face, feeling the raw, untamed power of the storm. It was a reminder that nature was not only gentle, not only stillness and serenity, it was also fierce, wild, unpredictable. And yet there was beauty in its fury. He stood there until the rain slowed, until the thunder softened into distant murmurs. The storm had passed, leaving behind the scent of damp earth, the drip of water from the leaves, the hush that follows nature's greatest tempests. He breathed it in deeply. Reading by lantern light as the days grew longer, Thoreau found himself. Reading more in the evenings, he would sit by the small wooden table in his cabin, a single lantern casting its flickering glow over the pages of a book. Plato, the Bhagavad Gita, the poetry of Homer. These were not just words to pass the time. They were windows into other worlds, other minds. One night he came across a passage in an old text that struck him deeply. "A man is rich in proportion to the number of things he can afford to let alone." He set the book down, staring into the dim lantern light. Was this not the very truth he had come here to learn? Men in town labored endlessly for more wealth, more land, more comfort. But what was truly necessary? How much could a man strip away before he found what was essential? For nearly a year now, Thoreau had lived with little, and yet he felt richer than ever before. The full moon over Walden one evening, as he sat outside his cabin, a full moon rose over the treetops, casting silver light across the landscape. The pond became a mirror reflecting the heavens above. In that stillness, that perfect moment of quiet, Thoreau felt something indescribable, something beyond words, beyond thought, a deep, abiding peace. Here, away from the distractions of society, away from the endless demands of daily life, he felt as though he had touched something eternal, not just the beauty of nature, but something deeper, the very essence of existence itself. Chapter 6. The Height. Of summer, a season of abundance, summer at Walden Pond was unlike anything else. By July, the air shimmered with heat, thick with the scent of pine and blooming wildflowers. The pond, once frozen and still, now danced with dragonflies skimming the surface, their iridescent wings catching the sunlight. The forest hummed with life, birds calling from the canopy, the rustle of small creatures moving unseen in the underbrush. For Thoreau, this was the season of plenty. Berries grew in clusters along the trails, wild blueberries, blackberries, and raspberries bursting with flavor. The fields beyond the woods were thick with corn and goldenrod, bending in the warm breeze. Each morning he harvested from his bean field, his fingers moving deftly among the green vines. There was no hunger, no lack, no struggle, only the slow, patient rhythm of a life in tune with the land. A visit from the townsfolk one afternoon. As he sat outside his cabin, a group of visitors arrived. They were from Concord, acquaintances, curious onlookers, perhaps a few skeptics. They asked questions. Some admired his simple way of life, others could not understand it. "But don't you ever get lonely out here?" one man asked, shifting uncomfortably on the log where he sat. Thoreau smiled. "I have the pond for company, the trees, the wind, and every book I could ever need." The visitors laughed, though some seemed puzzled. To them, solitude was an emptiness to be filled. To Thoreau, it was fullness itself. As they left, one man turned back. "If you ever want company, Henry, you know where to find us." Thoreau nodded. "And if you ever want solitude, you know where to find me." Reflections on society that night. As he sat by the water, he thought about the men from town. They lived their lives chasing comfort, security, wealth. But at what cost? They worked from dawn to dusk, their time consumed by obligations, their minds burdened with worry. They built fine houses, but never had the time to sit and enjoy them. They bought fine clothes, but never walked barefoot on the earth. Was that truly living? Or was it just a different kind of wilderness, one of debts and expectations, of ceaseless striving with no real destination? Here at Walden, Thoreau had everything he needed. The sun rose, the water shimmered, the birds sang, and in that simplicity there was more richness than all the gold in Concord. A canoe on the pond one morning, Thoreau found an old canoe lodged in the reeds. It was weathered, its wood darkened by time, but still sturdy. He pulled it onto the shore, inspected its frame, and decided to set out across the water. Pushing off, he let the current carry him, the paddle resting across his knees. The pond, so familiar from its shores, seemed larger from the water. The trees curved overhead, their reflections merging with the sky. The ripples from his canoe spread outward, as if the water itself breathed in slow, steady rhythms. He drifted for hours, thinking of nothing, thinking of everything. Above him, a hawk circled. Below, fish darted in the clear shallows. The world was in motion, yet utterly still. A storm in the night. That evening, as Thoreau lay in his small bed, a storm rolled in. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the walls of his immense cabin. Thunder cracked in the distance, and rain lashed against the roof. He listened, awake in the darkness, feeling the raw power of nature pressing in around him. There was no fear, only awe. Long ago men had slept beneath open skies, listening to the same storms, feeling the same wonder. In those moments he felt not alone, but connected to all who had ever lived close to the earth, who had known its rhythms, its tempers, its gifts. The storm passed, and silence returned. He closed his eyes, the scent of wet pine drifting in. Through the window, a day of walking. Of Thoreau's greatest pleasures was simply walking. With no destination in mind, he would set off in the morning, barefoot when the earth was warm, feeling the rough texture of the dirt path beneath his feet. The forest was alive, rabbits darting between brambles, squirrels scurrying up oak trunks, the occasional flash of a deer's white tail disappearing into the green. He knew the land like a friend. Every rock, every fallen tree, every stream had become familiar. He could tell when the wind would shift by the way the leaves moved, sense the coming of rain by the smell in the air, and yet no two walks were ever the same. Each day the world was new, encounters with the wild one afternoon, while resting beside a grove of pines he saw something move in the underbrush, a fox, its coat a striking red, its eyes sharp with awareness. It paused, watching him, its body tense as if deciding whether to flee. Thoreau did not move. For a long moment man and animal simply looked at each other. Then, with a flick of its tail, the fox turned and vanished into the trees. Such moments, brief yet profound, reminded him of his place in the world. He was not separate from nature, not above it, but part of it, just another creature passing through, living, breathing, watching. The hum of insects. The hottest days, the air was thick with the sounds of summer, the rhythmic drone of cicadas, the chirping of crickets, the occasional buzz of a dragonfly zipping past his ear. He found music in these sounds, a symphony composed not by men but by the world itself. Even the stillness had its own melody, the whisper of the wind through the reeds, the gentle lapping of water against the shore. To Thoreau there was no silence in nature. There was only harmony, nourishment from the land. His diet was simple. In the morning he ate wild berries he had gathered the day before, blueberries that stained his fingers, raspberries bursting with flavor. For lunch a handful of nuts, a few small fish caught from the pond, a loaf of bread he had baked over the fire. His bean field provided plenty, rows of green stalks stretching toward the sky, their roots pulling life from the soil. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, not just for sustenance, but for gratitude. Every meal was a reminder of how little one truly needed to live well. A midnight swim one night, unable to sleep, he stepped outside, into the warm air. The pond was still, reflecting the moon so perfectly that it seemed like another world existed beneath its surface. On impulse, he stripped off his clothes and waded in. The water was cool against his skin, his body slipping beneath. The surface in perfect weightlessness. He floated, staring up at the vast sky, feeling as if he had become part of it, drifting, silent, infinite. In that moment there was no past, no future, only now. The sound of the train at times, he heard the distant whistle of the train from Concord. It was a reminder that the world continued beyond Walden Pond, that people rushed about their business, that society marched forward, ever restless. He wondered about the passengers. Were they happy? Did they feel the wind on their faces, the warmth of the sun on their backs? Or were they too consumed by worries, schedules, ambitions? The train would pass, and silence would return. And Thoreau would return to his thoughts, content that he had chosen a different path, the rhythm of the days. Now Thoreau's life had settled into a rhythm as steady as the ripples on Walden Pond. Each morning he woke with the first light, stretching beneath the rafters of his small cabin. The wooden walls, warmed by weeks of summer sun, smelled of pine and earth. He would step outside, bare feet pressing into the cool ground, and breathe in the crisp morning air, fresh with the scent of dew and the faint distant smoke from Concord's chimneys. After a simple breakfast, perhaps a slice of bread, a handful, of berries, or a cup of pond water heated over the fire, he would begin his work, tending the bean field, gathering wood, mending his clothes. But work never felt like labor. It was a conversation with the land, a way of living in harmony with the seasons. By midday, as the sun reached its highest point, the forest became hushed, the air thick and heavy with heat. This was the time for reading. Sitting in the shade of a great oak, he would lose himself in the pages of Homer, Virgil, or the Bhagavad Gita. The words were ancient, but their wisdom felt immediate, as if they had been written not for kings or scholars, but for anyone who cared to listen. And in the evening, as the sky burned orange and gold, he would sit by the pond and let the silence speak. A visit from Emerson. One afternoon, as Thoreau pulled weeds from between the rows of beans, he heard footsteps on the trail. A familiar voice called out, warm and amused, "Hard at work, Henry?" It was Ralph Waldo Emerson, his friend and mentor, the man who had first encouraged him to live deliberately, to seek wisdom in the solitude of nature. Thoreau dusted his hands on his trousers and gestured to the field. "A philosopher must also be a farmer, you know," Emerson chuckled. "And what great truths have you unearthed today?" They walked together along the pond's edge, talking of poetry, philosophy, the future. Emerson, ever the thinker, spoke of society's progress, of cities expanding, industries rising, mankind marching ever forward. Thoreau, ever the questioner, wondered if it was truly progress at all. They parted as the sun dipped behind the trees. "Come visit Concord soon," Emerson said. "I may," Thoreau replied, though he knew he would not. The long golden dusk summer evenings at Walden stretched on forever. The sky remained painted in deep purples and oranges long after the sun had slipped below the horizon. Fireflies flickered in the reeds. The forest, so still in the heat of the afternoon, now came alive, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of something unseen moving through the underbrush. Thoreau would sit on the threshold of his cabin, watching the pond reflect the stars. How many others across centuries had gazed up at the same constellations? How many had pondered the same questions, felt the same longing for understanding? Here, beneath the vast, unchanging sky, all of time seemed to converge. And yet, in the quiet, he felt no urgency. Only peace, thunder on the horizon. One evening, as he paddled across the pond, he noticed dark clouds gathering in the distance. The air was thick, heavy, charged. The birds had gone silent. The trees stood still. He pulled his canoe to shore and sat on the rocks, waiting. Then, with a sudden flash of lightning, the sky split open. Thunder rolled across the hills. The wind came alive, bending the trees, sending waves crashing against the shore. The storm raged, wild and unrelenting, and Thoreau laughed. Here was nature in its rawest form, untamed, magnificent, free. He let the rain drench him, let the wind push against his chest. He felt small, powerless, insignificant, and yet, in that humility, he felt more alive than ever before. By dawn the storm had passed. The world was clean, renewed. The sun rose over Walden, turning the water to gold, and Thoreau, still dripping, stepped into the new day with a quiet, knowing smile. The language of birds. Each morning, before the sun had fully risen, Thoreau listened. The birds were his alarm clock, the trilling of robins, the sweet whistles of thrushes, the sharp caws of crows marking the early hours. He had learned to tell the time by their calls. The whip-poor-will called out in the dim hours before dawn. The chickadees sang as the sun crested the trees. He often sat by the pond and simply watched. How effortlessly the birds lived, building nests with delicate precision, searching for food, calling to one another in a language older than human speech. And yet there was no hurry, no waste, no excess. They took only what was needed. Man, he thought, could learn much from the birds. A rare encounter one evening, as Thoreau walked along a narrow woodland path. He caught sight of a dark shape moving between the trees. A black bear. It had not noticed him. He stood still, watching as the great animal lumbered forward, its massive shoulders rolling with each step. It stopped at the base of an oak and reared up on its hind legs, sniffing the bark, claws scraping against the rough wood. Thoreau did not feel fear. The bear, like him, was simply living. After a moment it lowered itself back to all fours and disappeared into the shadows. Thoreau exhaled, feeling as if he had been given a rare gift, a glimpse into a world that existed whether or not he was there to see it. The heat breaks. The summer had been long and relentless, the air thick and heavy, with warmth. But one morning something changed. The breeze carried a different scent, cool, sharp, almost electric. The pond's surface, so often smooth and still, now rippled with the hint of wind. The leaves, though still green, rustled as if whispering a secret. Thoreau sat by the water's edge, feeling the shift. The height of summer was past. The wheel was turning. Autumn was coming. Chapter 7. The first hints of autumn. A subtle change. At first, the change was almost imperceptible. The mornings were just a little cooler. The afternoons held a crispness that had been absent before. The sun, once blazing high overhead, now slanted lower, casting longer shadows across the land. Thoreau watched as the world around him responded. The squirrels worked with a new-found urgency, gathering acorns, stuffing them into hidden caches beneath tree roots. The birds, once so bold and loud, now sang with a different tune, softer, wistful, as if preparing for departure. And then, one morning, he saw it, a single leaf, yellow among the green, the first true sign. Reflections by the fire as the nights grew cooler. Thoreau began lighting small fires outside his cabin. He would sit by the flames, listening to the crackling of burning wood, staring into the embers as if they held answers to questions he had yet to ask. He thought of time, how quickly the summer had passed, how all things must change. Did the trees mourn the loss of their leaves? Did the birds feel sorrow when the time came to leave? Or did they simply accept the turning of the seasons as part of life's great rhythm? He pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders. The air smelled of pine smoke, of damp earth, of something fading and something new beginning. Autumn had arrived. The symphony of the changing forest with each passing day. The transformation of the woods became more evident. The green canopy that had once sheltered Thoreau from the summer sun was now tinged with gold, amber, and deep crimson. The wind carried with it the dry, papery whisper of falling leaves, swirling them across the forest floor in small, restless eddies. The air itself had changed. The thick humidity of summer had given way to something sharper, clearer, a breath of cold creeping in from the north. Mornings now carried the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, of pine resin and wood smoke, and with the change came a deepening stillness. The riotous chatter of summer insects had faded. The birds, once so lively in their morning symphonies, now called out less frequently, their songs softer, more thoughtful. Even Walden Pond seemed quieter. Its waters, once alive with the constant splash of frogs and darting fish, now lay smooth and undisturbed, reflecting the fiery hues of the trees above. Thoreau found himself listening more intently, as if the land itself were whispering its farewells. Visit from the harvesters one afternoon, as Thoreau sat outside his cabin, sharpening the blade of his axe. He heard the distant sound of voices. They were coming from the direction of the road, low, steady murmurs, the occasional burst of laughter, the rustling of sacks, harvesters. A group of farmers from Concord was making their way through the woods, carrying baskets of apples, sacks of potatoes, bundles of dried corn. They paused when they saw him, some nodding in recognition, others looking at him with quiet curiosity. "Winter's coming early this year," one of the older men remarked, adjusting the sack over his shoulder. Thoreau smiled. "Winter always comes on time. It is we who are unprepared." The man chuckled and tossed him a bright red apple. "Still keeping yourself busy out here?" another asked. Thoreau held up his axe. "The trees still grow, and I still have firewood to split." They spoke for a while, exchanging news of the town, the harvest, the latest debates in Concord. Some asked about his solitude, whether he felt lonely, whether he missed the comforts of home. He only smiled. After all, what greater comfort was there than the golden light filtering through autumn leaves, the quiet lapping of water against the shore, the knowledge that one needed little to be content? As the harvesters departed, he bit into the apple, its crisp sweetness filling his mouth. A gift from the land, a gift from the season. Preparing for the cold with the arrival of autumn, Thoreau knew it was time to prepare. His mornings were now spent, gathering firewood, splitting logs with rhythmic swings of his axe. He stacked them neatly beside his cabin, forming a wall of rough-cut timber that would see him through the winter. He patched the roof where it had begun to sag, reinforcing it against the heavy snows he knew would come. He gathered the last of the wild berries, drying them in the sun, and dug up roots to store in earthen jars. The work was steady, purposeful. He did not feel rushed, nor did he dread the coming winter. The seasons had their cycles, their demands, and he would meet them as he always had, with quiet determination. The wild geese, one evening as he sat by the pond, watching the first thin wisps of mist curl over the water, he heard a sound that sent a shiver through his spine. The distant echoing cries of geese. He turned his gaze upward, searching the darkening sky, and then he saw them. A great V-shaped formation silhouetted against the dimming light, their wings beating in unison, their calls sharp and clear. They were heading south. The sight filled him with an indescribable emotion, something between awe and sorrow. The geese knew, as all creatures did, when it was time to leave. They did not question, did not hesitate. They simply followed the call of the season, trusting in the ancient rhythm that had guided them for generations. Thoreau exhaled, his breath visible in the cooling air. Autumn was deepening, and winter was just beyond the horizon. The gathering of the forest as the days grew shorter, Thoreau observed how the animals around Walden Pond responded to the shifting season. The squirrels, once playful and careless in the summer heat, were now industrious, racing along the branches, stuffing their cheeks with acorns and darting into their burrows. He watched as a red fox trotted along the shoreline one morning, its thickening coat gleaming in the sunlight. It paused, sniffing the air, its amber eyes scanning the woods before it vanished into the undergrowth. The birds, too, were preparing. Some had already left, silent absences in the canopy where their songs had once filled the air. Others, like the hardy crows and woodpeckers, remained, their dark forms moving between the nearly bare trees. It was a season of gathering, not just for the creatures of the forest, but for him as well. The final harvest one crisp morning, Thoreau walked to his small garden patch where the last remnants of his summer crops still clung to the earth. The beans had run their course, their vines withering in the cool air, but a few hardy root vegetables remained. Carrots, turnips, potatoes, half buried beneath the soil. He knelt, his fingers pressing into the cold earth as he pulled them free. The scent of damp soil rose around him, rich and familiar. It was a modest harvest, but enough. Back at the cabin he laid them out to dry beside the last of his gathered berries and nuts. He took stock of his provisions, flour, salt, dried fish. From the summer, the stores of firewood lining the wall. Winter would be hard, as it always was, but he had what he needed, and if the land had taught him anything, it was that enough was always sufficient. The first frost one morning, he awoke to a world transformed, the trees, the grass, even the edges of the pond, all coated in a fine crystalline frost. The air was sharp in his lungs, and as he stepped outside, his breath curled in the morning light. Like smoke from a chimney, he ran his fingers along the railing of his small porch, tracing the delicate patterns of ice that had formed overnight. The Walden Pond itself had a thin glass-like sheen at the edges, only a whisper of ice, not yet strong enough to hold weight, but a promise of what was to come. Winter was near, and yet Thoreau did not feel dread. There was a beauty in the starkness of the season, in the stillness it brought. He sat on a log, cradling a cup of warm tea in his hands, and simply watched. As the morning sun slowly melted the frost, turning the world golden once more. A visit from an old friend that afternoon, as he stacked another bundle of firewood beside his cabin, he heard the crunch of footsteps on the cold earth. Looking up, he saw a familiar figure emerging from the trees, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Wrapped in a heavy coat, his boots dusted with frost, Emerson lifted a hand in greeting. "I thought I might find you here," he said with a knowing smile. Thoreau grinned. "Where else would I be?" They spoke for a time, walking along the pond's edge, discussing the changing season, the latest happenings in Concord, and the ever-deepening philosophy that had taken root in both their minds. "I sometimes wonder if the world outside these woods moves too fast," Emerson mused, watching the water ripple against the shore. Thoreau nodded. "It does, but here time belongs to the trees, the wind, the shifting light. There is no hurry in nature." They stood in silence for a while, the crisp autumn air around them. Then, with a warm farewell, Emerson turned back toward the path leading home. Thoreau watched him disappear into the trees, then turned once more to his cabin, to his firewood, to the life he had chosen. The world beyond Walden Pond would always call to him, but this quiet, deliberate existence, was his answer. The woods at dusk as the days shortened. Thoreau took longer walks through the forest, drawn to its shifting colors and the crisp scent of decaying leaves. The reds and golds of the maples flared like small fires against the deepening green of the evergreens. At dusk, the light filtered through the thinning canopy in long, golden beams, casting long shadows that danced with the wind. He listened carefully to the sounds of the forest in transition, the hushed rustling of falling leaves, the occasional sharp cry of a hawk circling above, the distant knock of a woodpecker against a dying birch. One evening, as he stood near the pond's edge, he heard the faint honking of geese. Looking up, he saw their perfect V formation cutting across the sky, their wings beating in rhythm with the turning of the seasons. He felt a quiet admiration for them, these travelers who knew when it was time to leave. Unlike them, he had chosen to stay, and he would face whatever lay ahead. Nights by the fires, the nights grew colder. Thoreau found himself relying more on the warmth of his small fireplace. The logs crackled softly, casting flickering shadows along the cabin walls, filling the space with the rich scent of burning wood. Some nights he wrote by candlelight, recording his thoughts on the changing world around him. Other times he simply sat, wrapped in a woolen blanket, gazing into the flames, listening to the wind press against the cabin walls. Outside, the world was hushed, wrapped in the first whispers of winter's breath. Inside, he was warm, a solitary. Feast one late afternoon, he prepared a modest meal, roasted root vegetables, a handful of dried berries, and a fresh loaf of bread he had baked in his small stone oven. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, grateful for the simplicity of it. In Concord, such a meal might have seemed too plain, too meager, but here, in the woods, it was more than enough. As he finished, he leaned back in his chair, listening to the distant howl of a coyote somewhere deep in the forest. Life was quiet. Life was full, and as autumn faded, he felt ready for what was to come. Chapter 8. The First Snow. A World Transformed. One morning Thoreau awoke to an unfamiliar silence. The usual rustling of leaves was gone, the whispering of the wind muffled. As he stepped outside, the reason became clear, a thick blanket of snow covered everything, the trees, the cabin roof, the shoreline of the pond, all softened under a pristine layer of white. The world looked untouched, as if it had been created anew in the night. He bent down, scooping a handful of snow into his palm. It was light, powdery, the first true snow of the season. Looking out over the pond, he saw the ice forming along the Shechem, edges creeping inward, a slow inevitability. Winter had arrived, the weight of winter. The first snowfall was gentle, but winter's presence was undeniable. The once fluid world of autumn had solidified, water to ice, wind to stillness, movement to pause. Thoreau walked through the forest, his boots crunching over the freshly fallen snow, leaving a solitary trail behind him. The trees, now stripped, bare of their leaves, stood like silent sentinels beneath their snowy burden. He reached out to touch the trunk of a great oak, feeling the cold roughness of its bark beneath his fingertips. Every sound was different now. The dry rustling of leaves had been replaced by the muffled hush of snow, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow even the echoes of his own footsteps. The chirping of birds was rare now, save for the crows and jays, their calls sharp against the winter sky. Even the pond, his constant companion, had begun its slow transformation. Ice clung to the edges, creeping inward each day. Soon it would be sealed entirely beneath a thick, glassy surface. Winter had a weight to it, not just in the physical sense, but in the way it pressed upon the spirit, demanding patience, endurance, and quiet strength. He took a deep breath, exhaling a plume of white mist into the crisp air. The season had changed. Now he must change with it. The first true cold. The first snowfall had been light. The next storm was not. One evening, as Thoreau sat by his fire, he heard the wind begin to rise, howling through the trees like a restless spirit. Snow battered against the cabin walls, piling high against the doorframe, sealing him inside. For the first time since coming to Walden, he felt a twinge of unease. Would his firewood last? Had he prepared enough food? He rose and checked his supplies. The logs were stacked high along one wall, enough for weeks if he rationed them properly. His dried vegetables, grains, and smoked fish were carefully stored, though the variety was growing thin. He would be fine. Still, as the wind roared outside and the cabin creaked under the strain of the storm, he felt the profound isolation of his existence more deeply than ever before. There was no one to call for help, no neighbor to visit, only himself, the fire, and the storm. The stillness of the morning. After, when he finally awoke the next morning, the world had gone quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of untouched white. He stepped outside, the air so cold it stung his lungs. The snow had buried the path to the pond. It had swallowed the footprints of deer and foxes, leaving no trace of the life that had moved here before. A new world, a world reset. Thoreau took his shovel and began to dig a path, each scoop of snow a reminder of his place in this vast, untamed wilderness. This was his life now, each day a test, each moment a lesson, and winter had only just begun. The frozen world winter tightened its grip on Walden Pond. The days grew shorter, the sun a pale ghost behind a curtain of gray clouds. The air smelled of frost and wood smoke, crisp and clean, but heavy with the stillness of the season. Thoreau awoke each morning to a thin layer of ice forming along the inside of his cabin's windows. His breath hung in the air as he pulled his woolen blanket closer, listening to the faint creaking of the trees outside. The pond, once a mirror of the sky, had transformed into an unbroken sheet of ice. He tested it carefully one morning, stepping onto its surface with deliberate caution. It held firm beneath his boots, a testament to the deepening cold. Beneath that ice, the fish still moved, slow, patient, waiting for the return of spring. Much like him, the art of keeping warm survival in winter was not just about food or shelter, it was about warmth. Fire became his closest ally, the steady heart of his home. Each morning before anything else, He knelt by the hearth, coaxing the embers back to life. The dry kindling caught quickly, the flames licking up into the darkness, chasing away the cold that had settled overnight. He rationed his wood carefully, knowing that every log burned was one less for the days ahead. Chopping more in this weather was an arduous task, but necessary. One afternoon he spent hours splitting logs, his breath coming in thick clouds as his axe bit into the frozen wood. The rhythm of the work was almost meditative. The swing, the crack, the fall of split wood onto the pile. By the time he finished, his muscles ached, his hands stiff with cold, but the sight of the stacked logs brought satisfaction. Winter would not break him. Encounters in the snow, despite the quiet, Thoreau was not entirely alone. One morning, while walking through the forest, he noticed fresh tracks in the snow, a fox moving lightly across the landscape. He followed them for a while, marveling at the creature's delicate steps, the way it had paused now and then to sniff the air. He had seen foxes before, darting through the underbrush in autumn, their coats bright against the fading leaves. But now, in the stark whiteness of winter, they were even more striking, their red fur a flash of life against the frozen world. He crouched low, scanning the trees, and there, just ahead, he saw it. The fox stood still, its black eyes fixed on him, ears perked, tail flicking gently behind it. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, with effortless grace, the fox turned and disappeared into the trees, vanishing as if it had never been there. Thoreau stood, exhaling slowly. Even in the dead of winter, life endured, and so would he. Reflections by the fire nights were the hardest. The silence pressed against the cabin walls, thick and heavy, broken only by the occasional groan of ice shifting on the pond. By firelight, he wrote. He wrote about the trees, about the fox, about the way the wind carved patterns into the snow. He wrote about solitude, not as loneliness, but as a deep and abiding presence, a thing to be understood rather than feared. Sometimes he thought about the world beyond the woods, the voices of Concord, the flickering lamps in town windows, the laughter of friends he had left behind. But he did not long for those things. He had chosen this life, and in the quiet glow of his cabin he knew he had chosen well. The weight of isolation. As winter deepened, the stillness became heavier. The days blended into one another, a slow and steady march through ice and snow. The solitude, once a comfort, now pressed against him like the cold itself. He had chosen to live alone, but the stark reality of winter made the choice feel more absolute. There were no travelers on the road, no casual encounters by the pond, no sounds of distant voices carrying through the trees, only the wind, only the fire, only his own thoughts. He spent long hours in contemplation, staring into the flames, letting memories surface like embers drifting into the night. He thought about the world outside Walden, the people he had left behind. Were they warm in their homes? Were they gathered together, sharing stories by the hearth? For the first time, he wondered if they thought of him too, but the thought passed as quickly as it came. He had set out on this journey to find something deeper than companionship, to understand the world, to understand himself. This solitude was part of that journey. He would embrace it. The struggle for food winter had stripped the land bare. The fields that once overflowed with berries and wild greens were buried beneath the snow. The streams that had teemed with fish were locked beneath thick sheets of ice. Even the birds, once so abundant, had mostly vanished, leaving only the hardiest creatures behind. Food became a daily concern. His stores were dwindling, each meal carefully measured, each portion stretched as far as it could go. One morning, he set out to check the traps he had placed near the edge of the forest. His breath curled in the air as he moved carefully through the deep snow, his hands buried in thick gloves, his scarf pulled tight against the wind. He found 2 rabbits, small but enough to sustain him, He carried them back to the cabin, skinning them carefully by the fire, the smell of roasting meat filling the air. It was a simple meal, a hard-earned meal. But as he ate, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the land, for the life it provided, for the understanding that every bite was part of a larger cycle. Out here, nothing was taken for granted. A visitor in the night one evening, as the fire crackled low and the wind howled outside, Thoreau heard something unexpected, a knock, not the sound of branches against the cabin, not the shifting of the logs in the hearth, a deliberate human knock. For a moment he wondered if he had imagined it. Then, again, 3 firm raps against the wooden door. He rose slowly, his pulse quickening, and unlatched the door. A figure stood outside, wrapped in heavy furs, their face red from the cold. A traveler, a lost hunter, someone from Concord. Thoreau stepped aside, wordlessly inviting them in. The figure hesitated for a moment, then entered, stamping snow from their boots, rubbing their hands together for warmth. The fire cast flickering shadows across the walls as Thoreau poured a cup of hot tea, placing it before his unexpected guest. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then the stranger smiled, a weary, grateful smile, and lifted the cup. In the depths of winter, even the most solitary soul must sometimes share his fire, the stranger by the fire. The man who had knocked on Thoreau's door was older, his beard streaked with gray, his face lined by years spent in the open air. His clothing was well worn, but sturdy. Leather boots caked in snow, a heavy wool coat pulled tightly around his frame. He carried a rifle slung over his shoulder, but it was clear from the way he moved that he was not here as a threat. Thoreau studied him in the flickering firelight. "You look like you've traveled a long way," he said at last. The man nodded, holding the warm tin cup between his rough hands. "Got caught out on the road," he said. His voice was low, edged with exhaustion. "Didn't think I'd find shelter before dark." Thoreau understood. Winter had a way of swallowing even the most experienced travelers. He motioned toward a chair by the fire. "Rest, warm yourself." The stranger settled in, stretching his hands toward the flames. For a while neither of them spoke. The fire cracked and hissed, and the wind outside howled against the wooden walls. Then the man exhaled deeply and looked at Thoreau with something like curiosity. "You live out here alone?" "I do." "For how long?" "A year and a half." "Now," the man shook his head, chuckling softly. "Most folks wouldn't last a month." Thoreau smiled faintly. He had heard as much before. But as he watched the man, his posture, his weary eyes, he realized something. This stranger, this traveler, was not just commenting on the hardship of solitude. He was speaking from experience. "You've lived this way before," Thoreau observed. The man nodded. "Trapped in the North Country for years," he said. "Lived in a cabin smaller than this. Good living, hard living." Thoreau poured him another cup of tea. "Tell me about it." And so, as the wind roared outside, as the fire burned low, the stranger told his story. He spoke of long winters spent alone, of hunting beneath the frozen sky, of nights when the silence was so deep it felt like the world had been swallowed whole. He spoke of rivers that froze so thick a man could walk across them without fear, of wolves that watched from the shadows, of the hunger that gnawed at his ribs when food was scarce. Thoreau listened intently. Here, in this moment, he was not alone. They were two men bound by the wilderness, by the knowledge of what it meant to survive where others would have turned back. The night stretched on, their words filling the small cabin like smoke from the fire. By the time the first pale light of dawn crept through the frost-rimmed window, the stranger stood, stretching, adjusting his pack. "I should be moving on," he said. Thoreau nodded. The man hesitated at the door. Then, with a small, knowing smile, he said, "Take care of yourself out here." Thoreau returned the smile. "You as well." The door opened, letting in a gust of frigid air. Then it shut again, and the stranger was gone, disappearing into the white expanse of winter. Thoreau stood for a long moment staring at the door. Then he turned back to the fire, adding another log, watching as the flames licked higher. Outside, the world was cold, but inside, for the first time in weeks, it did not feel so lonely. Chapter 9. The Passing Seasons. The forest awakens as the days stretched longer. Walden's woods transformed. The trees, once skeletal and lifeless, now shimmered with the first hints of green. Buds swelled on the branches, their tender leaves still curled, waiting for the warmth of the sun to coax them open. The morning air carried new sounds, birdsong, the soft hum of insects, the creaking of thawing wood expanding after months of bitter cold. Thoreau sat on his porch, watching the transformation unfold before him. He had come to know these woods intimately, not just as an observer, but as a participant in their quiet, unspoken rhythms. He had felt the sharp bite of winter, the hush of falling snow, the frozen silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. Now, in the early light of spring, he felt the shift, life returning, pulsing beneath the surface, waiting to burst forth. One morning, as he made his way toward the pond, his footsteps sinking slightly into the damp earth, he noticed fresh tracks. Deer, perhaps a fox. He knelt down, running his fingers along the soft indentations in the soil, tracing the path of the animal that had passed through in the night. Nature, he thought, is always in motion. Even when all seems still, life persists, adapting, changing, renewing. A visit from the outside world one afternoon, as he was chopping wood near his cabin, he heard the unexpected sound of footsteps, human footsteps. It was rare for him to receive visitors, and rarer still for someone to venture this far into the woods unannounced. He turned to see a familiar figure approaching, a neighbor from town, a man named Samuel, who occasionally passed through with news of Concord. "Henry," Samuel called, tipping his hat. "Thought I'd find you here." Thoreau set down his axe, brushing his hands together. "You've found me indeed." Samuel stepped forward, glancing around the clearing. "Spring's coming in. Fast this year. Good time to be out here, I suppose," Thoreau smiled. "Every time is a good time to be out here." Samuel chuckled, then pulled a small newspaper from his coat pocket, offering it to Thoreau. "Figured you might want to see what's happening in town." Thoreau took the paper but didn't unfold it right away. He wasn't sure if he wanted to be reminded of the world he had left behind. Yet something in him stirred. He had lived 2 years in solitude, immersed in nature, removed from the concerns of Concord and beyond. But now, with spring arriving, the pull of the outside world was growing stronger. Samuel stayed for a while, sitting on a log near the cabin, talking about the goings-on in town. Who had married whom? What debates raged at town meetings? What business had flourished or failed? Thoreau listened with interest, but without longing. "I suppose people are wondering when you'll be back," Samuel said after a pause. Thoreau exhaled slowly. "Perhaps," he said. "Or perhaps they've already forgotten me," Samuel laughed. "Hardly. You've always been the talk of the town, whether you're in it or not." The two men sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind move through the trees. Then Samuel stood, brushing the dust from his coat. "Well, I won't keep you from your solitude. Just thought I'd check in." Thoreau nodded, watching as Samuel made his way back toward the path leading to town. As he disappeared into the woods, Thoreau looked down at the newspaper in his hands. He hesitated, then set it aside. The world could wait a little longer. The pond's reflection. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Thoreau walked to the pond. The ice was gone now, fully surrendered to the warmth of spring. The water, dark and glassy, reflected the sky in perfect stillness. He crouched at the water's edge, trailing his fingers through the surface. Small ripples spread outward, distorting the reflection of the stars above. It struck him then how much had changed since the day he had first arrived at Walden. He had built his cabin with his own hands, endured the loneliness of winter, learned the quiet language of the forest. He had lived deliberately, as he had set out to do, but he had also changed. As he gazed into the pond, he wondered, when he finally left this place, would he still recognize himself in the reflections of the world beyond? A walk through the woods. Next morning, Thoreau set out on a walk, as he often did, letting his feet choose the direction. The air smelled fresh, damp earth, budding leaves, the faint sweetness of pine. The forest was alive in ways it hadn't been just weeks before, a slow awakening from winter's slumber. He stopped by a fallen log and ran his hand over the rough bark. Small patches of moss had begun to reclaim the wood, and tiny fungi sprouted in clusters along its edges. Even in decay, life persisted. As he wandered deeper into the woods, he found himself reflecting on his time here. He had once arrived at Walden Pond seeking solitude, simplicity, a retreat from the demands of society. And yet, as the months passed, he had discovered something else, an unbreakable connection, not only to nature, but to himself. Each season had revealed new lessons. In summer, he had basked in abundance, the warmth of the sun on his back, the ease of days filled with work and contemplation. In autumn, he had felt the urgency of nature's preparation, the quiet gathering of resources, the golden farewell of leaves before the long sleep of winter. Winter had tested him. It had pressed upon him with its silence, its loneliness, its deep, consuming cold. Yet he had endured, not through resistance, but through acceptance. He had come to understand that survival was not just about physical endurance, but about learning to live in harmony with the world around him. And now spring had returned, his second spring at Walden. The cycle had come full circle, but what did it mean? Would he stay for another year? Or was it time to return to Concord, to face the world he had left behind? He wasn't sure yet. A night by the fire that evening, Thoreau built a small fire outside his cabin. The flames flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the clearing. He sat with his knees drawn up, watching the embers glow and pulse, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The night was cool, but not cold. The stars above were bright, their light steady and unchanging. He thought of the great thinkers whose works he had studied, Emerson, the ancient philosophers, poets who had searched for truth in the same way he had. What would they say about his time at Walden? Had he succeeded in his experiment? Had he truly lived deliberately? The fire crackled, sending a spray of tiny sparks into the air. He smiled to himself. He supposed the answer didn't really matter. He had come to Walden to live simply, to strip away the excess, to see what remained when all distractions were gone. And in that, he had found something far greater than he had expected. He had found himself. The whisper of the wind as Thoreau sat by the fire. The wind stirred through the trees, rustling the new leaves like a whispered conversation. He closed his eyes and listened. There was something different about the wind in spring. It carried a promise, a sense of movement, of transition. It was the same wind that had once chilled him to the bone in winter, yet now it was gentler, almost inviting. He thought of the world beyond Walden, Concord, the townspeople, the endless discussions about progress and industry. He had once felt that the world moved too quickly, that people had forgotten the simple joys of existence. But had he truly escaped it here? Or had he merely paused for a while? The wind carried his thoughts outward, as if urging him toward a decision he wasn't yet ready to make, the last seeds of spring. The next morning Thoreau took his small bag of seeds and walked toward his bean field. He had grown fond of this ritual, the act of planting, of nurturing, of waiting. He had learned that nature followed no schedule but its own. The earth took its time, and he had come to respect that. Kneeling, he pressed the seeds gently into the soil, covering them with careful hands. He had done this the year before, had watched these same seeds push through the earth, reaching for the sun. It was a simple act, but it carried meaning. Wondered, when he eventually left Walden, who would tend this land? Would another wanderer come and pick up where he had left off? Would the forest reclaim his small patch of cultivated earth? He wasn't sure, but that was the way of things. Nothing remained unchanged. A letter from Concord that afternoon. Thoreau walked down to the town road, where he occasionally crossed paths with travelers. He had been expecting nothing, but today a passing mail carrier stopped and handed him a small envelope. It was from his family. He hesitated before opening it, as if the act itself would draw him back into the world he had left behind. Inside, the letter was simple, a few lines from his mother, updating him on life in Concord. His siblings were well. There were new debates in town about railroads and taxes. People still spoke of his absence, wondering when he might return. Thoreau folded the letter and tucked it into his coat. The world outside Walden was still moving, and soon he would have to decide whether he would move with it. The Pull of Two. Worlds as Thoreau walked back from the road, the letter in his pocket felt heavier than it should have, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented, a reminder that the world beyond Walden had not forgotten him. For nearly 2 years he had carved out an existence here, away from the hum of society. He had watched the seasons change, listened to the lake's whispers, studied the patterns of birds and beasts alike. He had learned that life, when stripped of excess, revealed itself in its purest form, and yet, as he stood at the edge of his bean field, staring out at the water, he wondered, was this enough? Could a man truly live apart from society forever? Or was solitude only meant to be a season in one's life, a place to gather wisdom before returning to share it? The echo of footsteps. That evening, as the sky darkened to a deep shade of violet, Thoreau heard footsteps approaching from the forest path. He recognized the sound immediately, firm, deliberate, unhurried. Emerson, his old friend and mentor, had visited before, always bringing news from Concord. Their conversations had often wandered from philosophy to politics, to the purpose of life itself. Thoreau turned to see Emerson stepping into the clearing, his coat lightly dusted with pollen from the season's bloom. "Henry?" Emerson greeted with a nod, his eyes scanning the cabin, the fire, the simplicity of it all. "You've come a long way," Thoreau said, half smiling. "And you've been away a long time," Emerson replied. The two men stood in silence for a moment. Then Emerson gestured toward the log by the fire. "Shall we talk?" Thoreau nodded and took a seat. The night air was cool but not unpleasant. "What have you discovered here?" Emerson asked, watching the fire flicker. Thoreau exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. "That a man needs very little to live well, that the world is full of distractions, but also full of beauty, if one is willing to slow down and see it." Emerson gave a thoughtful nod. "And yet, the world outside continues. Progress marches on, with or without us." Thoreau looked into the flames. He knew what Emerson was suggesting. It was the same question that had been stirring inside him for weeks now. Had his time at Walden run its course? Was it time to return? The choice. Ahead they spoke late into the night, the conversation weaving between past and future, solitude and society, purpose and duty. Emerson, as always, had a way of challenging Thoreau's thoughts, not with arguments, but with questions. As the fire burned low, Emerson finally stood stretching. "You've done something remarkable here, Henry, but the world still needs your voice." Thoreau met his gaze. "Perhaps," Emerson smiled knowingly, "when you're ready." With that, he turned and made his way back down the path, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. Thoreau sat alone for a long time after. The embers glowed softly in the dark. The night was quiet, save for the rustling of leaves in the wind, and deep within he felt the stirrings of change, the weight of silence. Long after Emerson had left, Thoreau remained seated by the dying fire. staring into the embers as if they held an answer. He had spent nearly 2 years at Walden Pond, learning, observing, living simply. He had built his home with his own hands, grown his own food, and found a rhythm in the solitude. The earth had taught him patience. The lake had taught him reflection. The passing seasons had shown him the quiet inevitability of change, but now something unsettled him. Was it the letter from his family, the words Emerson had spoken, or was it simply the realization that time moves forward even in the stillness of Walden? He had come here to strip life down to its essentials. But had he also been hiding? Thoreau closed his eyes and listened to the night. The wind stirred the leaves, the distant call of an owl echoed through the trees, and in the silence he heard the unspoken question rising in his mind. Was it time to go? The final walk around Walden. Next morning Thoreau woke before dawn. The sky was still dark, but the first hints of light were stretching across the horizon. Something in him told him to walk, one last time, to see the land as he had first seen it. He took the familiar path around the pond, his footsteps light. On the damp earth, the water was still, reflecting the sky like a perfect mirror. He paused at the spot where he had first built his cabin, where he had first driven the axe into the wood. He touched the rough bark of a pine tree, remembering the first winter, the frost that had crept into his bones, the hunger that had gnawed at his stomach. He walked past the place where he had watched the loon dive beneath the surface, vanishing into the depths, only to reappear yards away. He traced the edges of his bean field, where the soil had once been untouched, but now bore the marks of his labor. Everything around him was both unchanged and entirely different. Or perhaps he was the one who had changed. The last sunrise at Walden by. The time he returned to his cabin, the sun was rising over the treetops, bathing the pond in golden light. Thoreau stood at the water's edge and watched the day begin. For 2 years he had greeted the mornings here, had felt the quiet joy of waking with the world rather than against it. He had found what he had come searching for, not just solitude, not just simplicity, but clarity. A man could live deliberately. A man could strip away the excess. A man could find meaning in the smallest moments. And yet the world beyond Walden still called to him. With a deep breath, he turned away from the pond and walked toward his cabin. He had a decision to make. The final decision. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the ground, Thoreau stepped into his cabin. The small wooden space, once foreign, now felt like an extension of himself. Every worn plank, every handmade shelf, every tool in its place, each piece told a story of the life he had built here. Yet he knew now that this life, like all things, was not meant to last forever. He had come to Walden seeking solitude, but he had not become a hermit. He had walked to Concord, often engaged in conversations, and kept company with the thoughts of great philosophers. His retreat had never been about escaping life, but about understanding it more fully. He sat at his small desk, the rough wooden surface worn smooth beneath his hands. What would he write on this final morning at Walden? He dipped his quill into the ink and, on a fresh page, wrote, "I left the woods for as good a reason as I went there. Perhaps it seemed to me that I had several more lives to live, and could not spare any more time for that one." The words came easily, as if they had been waiting inside him all along. It was not a farewell to simplicity. It was not a rejection of solitude. It was an acknowledgment that the journey was not yet complete. Dismantling a life piece by piece over the next few days, Thoreau prepared to leave. He gathered what few possessions he had, his books, his journal, his writing materials. He cleaned the cabin, carefully stacking the firewood he would no longer need. The small garden he had tended, the bean field that had taught him patience, he left them behind, knowing nature would reclaim them in time. And yet, as he worked, he did not feel sadness. The world beyond Walden was waiting. His time in the woods had not been an end, but a beginning. On the last evening, he stood by the water one final time. The lake was calm, the trees stood tall, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. He breathed it in, feeling it settle in his bones. Tomorrow he would walk away, but Walden would always be with him. The road back to Concord before dawn, Thoreau lifted his small pack onto his shoulder and stepped onto the narrow dirt path leading away from the pond. With each step, the cabin faded behind him, swallowed by the forest. He walked past the towering trees that had been his silent companions, past the clearing where he had watched the seasons change, past the place where he had first stood 2 years ago, unsure of what he would find. The world beyond the woods awaited him. The lessons of Walden carried not in his hands, but in his heart. And as the sun rose, he walked on. The end. With this, the journey of Henry David Thoreau at Walden Pond comes to a close. His time in the wilderness shaped him, and his reflections would go on to shape the thoughts of generations to come. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Until next time.